A good-looking group of people. You guys are awesome. So, how many of you are fairly new to this practice?
Define new.
You're not new. I've talked to you.
I'm still a beginner's mind.
Right, yeah. Me too, right? For being quite honest. I think that's a good place to approach it from. Another question is, have you made this practice a part of your life? Have you embraced it? Have you developed a daily practice? Yeah. For me, when I started on this path, I didn't really know much about the Dharma. I didn't really know much about Buddhism. I basically just meditated, and with no real direction or guidance, and that's just kind of how my practice was for the longest time. Most of you have heard my story and how I started with this practice. So obviously in jail, I wasn't really able to get a hold of a lot of information about the practice. I could get books mailed to me, but I didn't even know what books to look for at that point. So, because I didn't really know anything else about it, all I did was sit. And it continued that way for quite a while, even after I got out of jail. And it was I quickly noticed that while the meditation was helpful to kind of get out of my head at times, it wasn't really having an effect on my life. I wasn't really transitioning from off of the cushion into daily life at that point. I was able to escape my thoughts momentarily, but that's really all that it was doing. It was just a momentary respite from discursive thoughts. And then once I would get off the cushion, it was right back to chaos. But with time, that did fade away. And the more I immersed myself in this practice, the more I really started reading the suttas, the more I really started taking the whole of the Dharma seriously and really committing myself to the Eightfold Path as it is laid out and not just the samadhi aspect of it, the more my life started to change and the more it started to open up. And so tonight, I want to talk kind of about that. I want to talk about perseverance on the path, give some reflections on perseverance on this path. I'd like to talk about what is known as dry practice, and I'd like to just talk a little bit about the importance of establishing a daily practice. So this spiritual journey, because that's at its core what it is often described as a path. And like any path, it requires dedication, it requires effort, and it requires a lot of wherewithal, to be quite honest. It requires this sense of determination and a willingness to stay the course. When we embark on a spiritual path, there can be some initial enthusiasm, being involved in something that's fairly new to us. There's always some excitement involved with it. We may experience feelings of joy, feelings of connectedness, and as if it's kind of working effortlessly at times. However, if we continue on this path, we'll begin to encounter some rougher terrain. Meditation is quite helpful for relaxation and bringing a sense of ease at first. You'll find, if you're anything like me, the more that you do it, the more it starts to bring up some of the iffier mental states. We start getting into what is known as the dark night of the soul territory if you persist on this path long enough. And, it can bring up a lot of, what Jung referred to as shadow sides of ourselves. You also run into what is known as a dry practice. And this is when you're kind of just sitting there and you're doing the meditation. And if you're doing a Brahma Vihara meditation, you're reciting the phrases, but it doesn't really seem to be having any real effect. You're kind of just saying the words and they're not really landing for you. You're not really feeling a change. You're not really noticing a change. This is what we would call a dry practice. Obviously, the opposite of the dry practice would be a wet practice, and that's where you are feeling some change happening. So if that's where you're at, if you're experiencing this dry practice, don't worry about that too much. It happens. The Buddha experienced a dry practice for a long time. He didn't achieve his awakening right away. It took some time. So when the Buddha was a child. He grew up, and the story is, and I take this with a grain of salt, that he was a prince and lived in a palace. Now we are talking about agricultural India 2,600 years ago, and they didn't really have palaces in agricultural India at that time. His family were farmers, so likely that they were the wealthiest farmers in the area. He was from the Shakya clan, and so they were probably just like the most well-to-do of the farming community. They probably had like the nicest mud hut, but it probably wasn't a palace. But he quickly realized that he was having luxury just lavished on him, and he noticed that didn't do anything to stop his suffering. No matter how much wealth his parents had, no matter how much he was kept away from the tragedies of life, the dukkha, how much he was shielded from death and sickness and aging, and he was, at least as far as the story is concerned, it did not stop his suffering. And he left the palace one day and came across what are known as the four heavenly messengers. He saw a man who was aging, and the attendant that he was with, he asked him, and he said, "Well, what's up with that guy?" And he's like, "Oh, he's getting old." He's like, "Is that going to happen to me?" He's like, "Yeah, that's going to happen to you." And then he came across a man who was sick, and he again asked the question. It's like, "Well, what's wrong with that guy? Is that going to happen to me?" And it's like, "Well, he's sick, and yes, all men get sick." And then he came across a corpse. He's like, "Holy fuck, what happened to that guy?" He's like, "He's a corpse. He's died." He's like, "Is that going to happen to me too?" Like, yeah, that's going to happen to you. He's like, "Aren't you getting the message by now? All these things are going to happen to you. You're a man like any other." And then he came across an ascetic, someone who's on the spiritual path, and the ascetic seemed to be pretty happy. He at that point got the idea, like, maybe that's what I should do. Maybe I should take up this spiritual life. And so he left the palace and disregarded all of the wealth that he was afforded and set about the life of a spiritual mendicant. He didn't become an ascetic right away. He actually studied with two teachers before them. And in this time in India, there was a lot of yogic meditation practices. In the Majjhima Nikaya 26, it says that he studied under Alara Kalama, who taught a meditation attainment called the sphere of nothingness. And he was asked by Alara to become an equal leader of their spiritual community because he excelled so well in this practice. And the Buddha didn't want anything to do with that at the time, so he moved on and began studying under another teacher. And this teacher was Uddaka Ramaputta, and he studied under him for a while. And with him, he had achieved high levels of meditative consciousness using a practice that was known as the sphere of neither perception nor non-perception. But he came to the conclusion that this does not lead to revulsion, to dispassion, to cessation, to calm, to knowledge, or to awakening or nibbana. And so again, he was asked to join his teacher in teaching, and he again declined. At this point, he did become an ascetic. If you're not familiar with what an ascetic is, they basically renounce all of the luxuries of life. They feel that luxury or craving is the opposite of the spiritual life. So they take about these ascetic practices, and they eat very little. They do very austere things to their bodies, and they basically self-flagellate themselves, and they torture themselves, essentially, is what ascetics do, at least in that lineage of ascetics. And the Buddha got really into this practice. The story goes that he was eating 1 grain of rice a day, and he became so emaciated that you could see his bones visibly through his skin. And if you would like to see what that looks like, you can Google emaciated Buddha, and they have several statues that depict Siddhartha during this time. I hesitate to call him the Buddha because at this time he was not awakened. So we have these statues of Siddhartha where he is completely emaciated, and you can see his bones just protruding through his skin. And they're very striking. It's almost like looking at Christ on like the Catholic Christ on the cross. It's like pretty grotesque, right? But that didn't work either. The ascetic practice didn't work. And so eventually he came to the conclusion that he was not achieving his awakening with this ascetic practice as well, and he felt like if he wanted to be able to continue on this path, he was going to have to eat. And there's actually several stories about this, about a girl from the village nearby named Sujatu feeding him rice pudding and kind of nursing him back to health. And so he takes the rice pudding and he continues on his spiritual path. And after regaining some of his vitality and his health, he's like, I'm going to figure this shit out once and for all. And this is where we get the story of him sitting underneath the Bodhi tree for 7 weeks, basically, is how long he is claimed to have sat. But that too wasn't without difficulty, because when the Buddha was trying to achieve this awakening, he encountered the demon Mara. And if you're not familiar with Mara, Mara is the lord of the underworld. And Mara did everything in his power to try to thwart Siddhartha from his awakening. He first he sent his daughters. Mara sent his daughters in the form of like sexy ladies to try to tempt the Buddha away from his practice. Thinking that he could use desire and craving, sensual craving, to tempt the Buddha away from his awakening. But the Buddha just said, I see you, Mara. I see you. So that didn't work. So at that point, he sent his armies. Mara sent his armies after Siddhartha. And they were firing a rain of arrows down on him. And the Buddha, they turned into flowers, according to the story. Right? Obviously take this all with a grain of salt. And that didn't work either. So then he tried to appeal to the Buddha's own sense of self-doubt. Saying, who do you think you are? Trying to attain this awakening. You're just a man. You'll never awaken. And even if you did, no one is here to see you awaken. No one will ever believe you. No one will bear witness. And at this point, the Buddha, or Siddhartha, puts his hand on the ground and said, let the earth be my witness. And at that point, he awakens. And he becomes the awakened one. He becomes the Buddha. And I think the point that I'm trying to get at with that story is that the Buddha didn't wake up overnight. It took him many years to achieve his awakening. It took him many paths to achieve his awakening. And it's also important to note that the ways that Mara showed up for Siddhartha. He showed up as this craving, and he showed up as aversion, and he showed up as doubt. And essentially what Mara is the personification of what are known as the 5 hindrances. These are our hindrances to awakening. These are hindrances that will bind us up on the path. And those are craving, lethargy, or craving, aversion, lethargy, restlessness, and doubt. All these qualities that we all have that will thwart us from our awakening. And so if you're experiencing any of these in your practice, you're not alone, because the Buddha did too. It's during these times that it's so crucial to persevere and stay the path. It's easy to give in to the temptation of abandoning our practice altogether, saying, I'm done with this, I'm not seeing any change, this isn't working. Trust me, I've been there many times. But just as a seed needs darkness and nourishment to flourish, to sprout and flourish, that's kind of how our practice is going to be sometimes. It's not going to flourish immediately. It takes time, and it takes care, and it takes effort to cultivate. But the key to navigating these times and this dry practice is just trusting in the process. Knowing that this practice is a 2,600-year-old practice, and people are still committing to it, and they have for 2,600 years. And that says a lot right there to me. That says quite a bit, that people have not given up this practice for 2,600 years, and that for the past 2,600 years, somewhere, somebody is being mindful. Somebody is paying attention to their experience. Somebody is observing their thoughts arise and observing their thoughts pass and recognize them as not self. This path is not a linear progression. There's been several times where I have personally made progress and then circle back, made progress and then circle back. And that happens time and time again. It ebbs and it flows, it peaks and it valleys. And I still have times where I just don't feel like sitting. There's some days where I just don't feel like doing it. But much like the gym, it's the days where I don't feel like sitting that I probably should sit even more. But also we want to be gentle with ourselves. We don't want to torture ourselves with this practice. We don't want to make it something that we don't want to do. You have to have faith that the seeds that you're planting through this practice will eventually bear fruit. And they will. They will. Even though you're not seeing it at first, they will bear fruit over time. And that's how it was for me. I did this practice for quite a long time without ever seeing any real change. I didn't see changes in my perspective. I didn't see any changes in my perception. And so most of my early practice was this dry practice. I was just going through the motions, so to speak, especially when it came to doing metta practice. The idea of loving myself was crazy to me. For the longest time, I had an intense amount of self-hatred and self-aversion. I hated myself for the damage that I had done to my life, the decisions that I made that put me in the position that I was in, and I hated myself for where I was at and who I thought I was as a person. And again, at the end of the day, these were all just thoughts. So when I was doing metta practice, I was literally just saying the phrases without actually feeling any real effect. May I be at peace, may I be at ease, may I be kind and gentle with myself, may I be filled with loving kindness. And I repeat these phrases over and over and over, and it felt like, was like one of my teachers puts it, like being in like Dharma detention, right? Like I'm just writing it on the board, just over and over and over, just checking the boxes. Okay, may I be at peace, may I be at ease. And I didn't really feel it, right? And I can't honestly tell you when the shift happened because I don't know. Eventually, those phrases did have some effect. And they actually had a lot of effect. And today I can sit here and genuinely tell you that I don't hate myself. I, in fact, love myself very deeply. I care about myself very much. And that's something that I used to not be able to say. And if I did say it, I was lying, 100%. But you wouldn't even catch me lying about it, quite honestly. And so the point of that is that while I didn't notice it having any real effect, I didn't notice it working, it was working. We are rewiring the brain, and this is a training system. It's a training of the mind, and we are training the mind with repetition. And you may not see any immediate results, but you will see results eventually. But I'm not going to lie, it takes a lot of effort. It takes committing to it, it takes doing it, it takes living it, breathing it. So if you're here because you want to change, see a change in your life, you have to be really honest with yourself. It requires tough questions that often have tough answers. Like, what does your sila look like? What do your ethics look like? If your ethics aren't in alignment with your values, if you're not living your ethics, then that's the stuff that's going to come up first when you sit. All of the mistakes that you made, all of the times that you drop the ball with your ethics. Those are going to be the first things that arise during a meditation practice, which is why we lead with sila in this path. At least they do in Southeast Asia. Here we kind of lead with meditation. We start with meditation. That's where most people start with this practice here. But it's really important to make sure that our ethics are completely in line so that it makes our sitting practice easier. Because as I said, that will be the first stuff that comes up. And I know that from my own direct experience. How many of you have a daily practice? Sometimes? Yeah, me too. Most days. On my best days, right? Well, establishing a daily practice is a really powerful way to stay committed. Even during the challenging times of dry practice or the vicissitudes of life, having a daily practice is really important. It keeps us on the path, it keeps us committed, and finding time can be the hardest part. As I said, when I first started with this practice, I was only sitting. I didn't really concern myself with anything else because I didn't know anything else at the time. But having established a daily practice eventually adds this level of consistency. And now I look forward to my practice. It's not like if I have time anymore. It's like my life is scheduled around my practice. It's not always easy to find the time or the energy, but if your well-being is your concern, then I urge you to try to establish a daily practice. And you can start small. Just setting aside 5-10 minutes a day at first, because you may not have the attention, you may not have the physical ability to sit for longer periods than that at first. It's important to make sure that the body is fit enough to sit for those kind of durations. And having a dedicated place to sit helps a lot too. I have an altar, and I'm not urging you to set up an altar in your home, but having one particular place that you practice can be very conducive to meditation. Your body and your mind get used to it. It becomes accustomed to, this is what we do here. And that helps a lot. As you continue on this path, you may find that your practice naturally expands and you'll start carving out more time for it. The more you sit, the more you'll be inclined to want to sit. And that was the case for me anyway. It's also can be helpful to find accountability in the Sangha. You can lean on each other. You don't have to just meditate here on Mondays. Swap phone numbers, get together, sit together. Get to know each other outside of this room. The Sangha, as you've heard me say a million times, is the whole of the Dharma. It's about this community. It's about having peers on this path that we can bounce off of and help hold us accountable. Surrounding ourselves with like-minded individuals who are on the same path can inspire us and uplift us, during difficult times. And they can remind us of the importance and the perseverance that's required on this path, and they can encourage us to keep going. Just keep going. That's the biggest thing, is just keep going. No matter where you're at, no matter how you feel, just keep going. I know I've said this before, but that's what Sangha is for. That's one of the reasons I started this group, was to create a community of like-minded people. And it looks like I'm doing a pretty good job of that. So if you guys don't have each other's numbers, you probably should. Hang out together, sit together, go have pizza together, go bowling together. We should start a bowling league. That'd be cool. That'd be a super cool thing to do. And just remember that this path that we walk on is unique for each of us, but there are a lot of similarities in it. We'll encounter our own challenges and setbacks along the way. But it's in those moments that we can find strength and hope in each other. Embrace the dry spells just as much as the times when the practice feels like it's flowing really well. Because it may not seem like it at the time, but it is working. You are growing. Things are changing. There's no way to stop that. Everything's always changing. With pace, with faith, and some patience and some perseverance, you can go very far on this path. One thing that I've learned through my practice is that if you show up for the Dharma, it shows up for you. Time and time again. You'll continue to evolve. You'll continue to wake up. So let's do it together. Let's evolve. Let's wake up together.